Hey guys, so I just saw Incredibles 2. Just a quick sort of random thing. It's kind of weird how the first film is called The Incredibles, and this one they've dropped the for some reason and just called it Incredibles 2. But I do like the fact that Pixar are actually pretty straightforward with their sequel titles. You know, they just sort of number them, basically, except for Finding Dory, which... yeah, that title basically makes sense because, Dory's the main character in that. But anyway, I know this film's been out in other parts of the world for about 3 or 4 weeks. It's just a weird thing Pixar seem to do. They bring their films out a little bit later here in the UK, or possibly it's all of Europe. Very frustrating, so I was very impatient to see this because I'd heard a lot of good things. You may recall I made a review quite a few years ago where my major complaint about the film was there was no sequel, and now there is at last. So I was really excited to see this. A bit disappointed that they picked up exactly where the last film left off. I say in that original review that I would like them to have set it like 10 years later, since, it is basically more than 10 years later now. But no, picks up exactly where the last film left off. It actually works to the film's advantage, actually, because they can bring back things from the previous film, the underminer, the character of Tony that Violet had a crush on, and also just sort of the ongoing issues of the family and the fact that superheroes are still illegal. That's kind of something that's just sort of pushed to the side in the first film, and I honestly completely forgot about that whole thing, even still being sort of in the open. Yeah, that they still have to sort of adjust to that and address that in some way. They bring in a Bob Odenkirk character who is a lot like Saul Goodman. As soon as he appears on screen, I'm sort of like, oh god, I'm just going to think of this guy as Saul the whole time. But actually, he's a very similar character to Saul, so it didn't really matter. So yeah, just a sort of whole issue of trying to make superheroes legal again. And it's weird, you had Batman v Superman and Civil War a couple of years ago, both asking the questions, are superheroes doing more harm than good? And now you've got this film as well doing it. So it's kind of all the craze at the moment. Sort of makes me wonder, actually, The Incredibles obviously are a Disney product, well, that Pixar, but Disney owned Pixar. Disney also owned Marvel. Could they make The Incredibles part of the MCU? Wouldn't that be awesome? Probably not, because they're animated. They could make an animated version of the MCU, maybe. But anyway, yeah, it's kind of sort of more of the family as a unit now, having to sort of adjust to the fact that superheroes are illegal and now they're out in the open and everybody's sort of seeing them maybe doing a lot of damage here. But what actually ends up happening is Helen is basically singled out as like the one person to sort of represent the whole team. It was always a kind of case of like Pixar just thought, well, we focused so much on Bob in the last film. Bob was like the guy. It's going to have to be Helen this time. They kind of just sort of did that just because we wanted it to be different. We did Bob last time, let's do Helen this time. Logical kind of decision, but it kind of struck me as a bit too much of like Bob Odenkirk's character literally just says, let's go with Elastigirl. It's basically just that they're sort of admitting, that they just want to do something with Helen just for the sake of it, because, Bob was the main guy in the previous film. And what actually happens is this is very much Helen's film, and the rest of the family are kind of reduced to subplots. It's quite good subplots you got here. You got Bob being the stay-at-home father, having to sort of readjust, and, the whole issue with Jack having powers. I don't really understand why they just assumed Jack didn't have powers. I mean, he's just a baby. I assume you're born with these powers, but surely the powers don't develop until a little bit later in life, at least. But I don't know. Maybe Violet and Dash as babies were running around and going invisible the whole time. That would have been a bit difficult for the parents to have to raise them without like that. Yeah, and it's also interesting, Jack seems to sort of have unlimited powers, whereas it's very sort of obvious what the powers of the other family have. So you got Violet in a kind of subplot with going on this date that was, set up at the end of the previous film. Inadvertently, Tony's memories of her are erased from his mind, kind of Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind style. Not quite sure how that happened or why it happened. It's just a sort of inadvertent thing, and as a result, he does not turn up for the date that they had arranged. It's kind of weird. Part of me sort of thought as soon as this happens, well, just ring Tony, find out where the heck he is. But, I forget the fact that this is kind of set in the 60s, or I think it might be the 50s, actually. No, actually it looked more 60s to me. So obviously there are no mobile phones, so she has to just sort of track him down at school and find out what has happened. Dash kind of doesn't really have anything to do. In fact, his role in the climax is just to press a button. Disappointing, really. I mean, he has quite a few sort of character scenes where he's being his eccentric and sort of rebelling against what his parents are saying, sort of Dash. But he doesn't showcase his powers very much. There's quite a few chase scenes actually in this film, and yet there's no point really where Dash is running around. That disappointed me. The action in this film, really good. Action and animation is always something I'm a little bit sort of sceptical about, because the great thing about action sequences that draws you in about them in live action is, it all looks like it's really happening and immerses you in the scene as if you're really there. And in animation, that's a bit more difficult to do because obviously everything on screen is fake. Literally none of it is actually happening. The only things that are real are the voices and maybe some of the sound effects. So with animated action sequences, you kind of just want some interesting kind of visuals, and you definitely get that with the showcasing of the powers, particularly with Helen's elastic abilities. You've got the chase scene with the train. You've got kind of a chase scene at the beginning with the Underminer. Actually, it's kind of weird. It's kind of a similar sort of chase scene at the end where that both of those scenes are them trying to stop a building or buildings from being destroyed by something. I thought the opening action scene and the climax action scene were actually a bit too similar. You've got a surprise villain, which is kind of something I feel is getting a bit old now, particularly in Disney films. It's kind of this sort of Scooby-Doo trait, of like, who's the villain? Can you figure out who it is? And you also have, it's kind of becoming also a bit of a cliche of unmasking the villain, and it's like, it's some guy. It's some sort of blank slate that it's someone we actually don't know, and it turns out to be a sort of decoy. And as soon as he was unmasked, I was sort of like, well, it's obviously not him. Obviously, someone else was pulling the strings because they're not just going to reveal the villain and it's going to be someone we don't know. So I'm like, well, the obvious candidate for it to be the villain would be the Bob Odenkirk character, but actually it wasn't him. It was his sister. Which, once it was revealed, I kind of thought to myself, actually, that maybe should have been kind of obvious to me, because I was actually thinking sort of up to that point, she is kind of pointless. We kind of just need Bob Odenkirk's character. We don't really need the sister there doing the odd thing here and there. Like, she doesn't have a massive amount to do, and what she did have to do, they could quite easily have had Bob Odenkirk's character do. I honestly can't remember his character's name, I'm sorry. And also, it's kind of a sort of a cliched scene when Helen figures it all out. She's sort of like, but if it wasn't him, then it must have been you! I mean, she doesn't literally say that, but it was a scene a bit sort of like that. They're figuring out who the villain was with the villain right there in the room with them. So, of course, the villain's like, they've rumbled me, they figured me out. And so they just, to her convenience, she has these hypnotic goggles that she can just shove on her face. They were actually pretty creepy, I thought, when they put the goggles on them and decided they're not themselves. That was pretty creepy. Although, I don't know, I see a bit of a flaw in the villain's plan if that's the whole way they're going to try and get the heroes to fight for them and take over the world, is just putting these sort of flimsy looking goggles on their face that can quite easily just be pulled off like in an instant. In fact, that's basically what happens. The way that the bad guy is defeated is basically just by pulling off the goggles off of all these superheroes that they have, and there you go. The day is saved basically. There's just a little bit of a scene where the villain has to make her escape or attempt to make her escape, and I almost feel like there were too many characters in this, because you have Frozone kind of being given very little to do, Bob not being given a huge amount to do in terms of his powers, but more just, just as a stay-at-home father. Dash being given literally nothing to do with his powers, and very little to do with as a character. Violet is kind of sort of well managed, although she is sort of reduced to a subplot with it just being, her and Tony. And obviously Helen it's her film basically. It's all about her. And then you also have all of these other sort of superheroes who are basically just there to sort of showcase their powers. It's kind of like, the extra X-Men that they bring in the X-Men films. A couple of them were sort of cool. You've basically got sort of Chell from the Portal games. I really like to see them bring her back if they do another film, because I really liked her power. I like to see her get her own film. I'm not sure if that's something Pixar have done, actually, spin-off films, but I would like to see her get her own film just because I really like that power they had. You've got a sort of crushing guy. Powers were a bit too similar to Bob's, really. It was sort of more telekinetic crushing of things, but I feel like what he was doing was something Bob could quite easily have just done with his hands. I can't really remember any other powers that they had. But yeah, really good action. Very wordy kind of film. I noticed there was a lot of talking in it, but it was like that in the first Incredibles. Very much Helen's film, which I like the character of Helen, but I would rather it be about the whole family. Dash, though, was the big negative for me. He was very much sort of pushed to the side, but overall, really good. I've been really sort of turning back and forth in my mind if it's actually as good as the first film. I don't think it's better, but I think it might be as good. And I really like the first one, just for the record. I think I might have to see this again a couple of times to be absolutely sure, because it was like that with the first Incredibles, actually. I wasn't massively impressed with the Incredibles the first time I saw it. And then I went back and watched it a couple more times and actually, you know what, this is really good. Probably going to have to be that with this film as well. I can see myself seeing this again and being like, yeah, you know what, this is as good. I wouldn't go as far to say it's better. There's nothing about this film that sort of stands out to me as like they've done that better than the first film. I'm trying to think, what could they have done better than the first film? I mean, they had great action, great villain, great characters, great dialogue, great concept. Maybe expand a little bit more on the concept a little bit more might have helped push that over the top. I'm not quite sure they went that far. I even noticed a couple of times characters were sort of saying the same things that I was sort of thinking. Like when they bring in Frozone, Mr. Incredible, and Elastigirl into this big announcement about superheroes being legal again, and they're wearing the goggles, and I'm like, isn't Bob Odenkirk going to think that's a bit odd? Huh? What's going on? And then he radios his sister and he's like, did you change their outfits? What's going on with these goggles they're wearing? So it's like, okay, yeah, fair enough. Edna, didn't mention Edna. She was kind of downplayed. I kind of actually expected that in a way, even though they brought back Brad Bird to do this film. Of course, he's the voice of Edna. I actually kind of felt like she'd run her course in the first film. They couldn't really do anything more major with her, but at the same time, they kind of knew if they didn't bring Edna back, all the fans would be like, oh, where's Edna? So they kind of just brought her back by popular demand, I think, and they gave her a decent amount to do. I kind of expected her to be a little bit more downplayed. I like what she did with Jack, actually. That really makes me want to see another film set like at least a few years later, so that Jack's at least like a kid, so he can properly showcase his powers. Violet would sort of be a young woman, and Dash, I guess, would be a teenager. That would be really interesting to see, and maybe Bob or Helen, or if not both of them, could be sort of semi-retired and not doing as much, and it would be more the kids' film. It would be more about the kids at that point. I definitely think they're going to do a third film at some point. It may not be until years later, but yeah, I definitely think, you need a trilogy for films like that. People sort of criticise Pixar a lot of the time for the constant sequels they're doing. In all honesty, though, the only Pixar sequels that I really have not liked are Cars 2 and Cars 3, and that's more really just because I don't like the Cars films in general. I didn't even like the first one. There hasn't yet been a Pixar sequel to a film I'd liked that I didn't like. So yeah, I'm perfectly fine with Pixar continuing to do sequels. I believe we've got Toy Story 4 next year, and then it's going to be a bunch of original films. So yeah, we may not see many Pixar sequels for a while, which perhaps is an indication that we're actually not going to see a sequel to this film for a while, which is kind of a bummer. The other one people have been demanding, I think, is Inside Out 2. Maybe. I'm not quite sure where else they can go with that concept. The obvious idea they had was like Riley would be like a teenager, and there's all the kind of different things you can do with teenage emotions. I'm not sure that would make for a particularly interesting story, to be honest, particularly for a kids' film. Yeah, that's not something I personally would want to see. A sequel to Monsters, Inc., I think, is the other one people are suggesting. We've had a prequel, now have a sequel, maybe. Again, I don't know really know what you could do that. People are suggesting, Boo could be like a teenager or a young woman, and she could like still be hanging out with Sully or something. Doesn't sound very interesting, if I'm honest, but that's just me. This was really good. I would say if it's not on par with the original, it's pretty damn close. So yeah.